Sweet. When I was a kid, don't worry, I'm not going to go delve in the depths of my childhood, but when I was a kid, I used to read a lot of science fiction. And one of my favourite books when I was a kid was a science fiction comedy, or farce if you like, called The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. I don't know if you've heard of it before. It was written by a guy called Douglas Adams, and he's an atheist. I didn't know that at the time, but found out afterwards. And a big fan of Richard Dawkins, who's an atheist and an evolutionary biologist, who essentially says that life is meaningless. And that's very much reflected in the book. I'd like to read you just a tiny little quote to start things off. And then one Thursday, nearly 2,000 years after one man had been nailed to a tree for saying how great it would be to be nice to people for a change, a girl sitting on her own in a small cafe in Rickmansworth suddenly realised what it was that had been going wrong all this time, and she finally knew how the world could be made a better and happy place. This time it was right, it would work, and no one would have to get nailed to anything. And afterwards the world is blown up. Being Easter, I want to talk to you about why it is that Jesus got nailed to a cross and why it is that we still talk about this today. I want to tell you a couple of stories. An Israeli politician was touring the occupied territories of Palestine, and he was touring land where Palestinians' olive groves had been bulldozed to make way for Israeli housing. And he had a military guard, and in the course of protests, one of the soldiers was shot and seriously wounded. Now the politician ran away, as politicians do, and because the gunfire was so heavy, the soldiers' comrades had to leave and left the body behind, left him to die. The only person who came to his aid was an old Palestinian woman whose son had been killed by Israeli soldiers and whose olive grove had been bulldozed. Now that's not a real story, but I tell that to try and get us to think more about the whole idea of what it means to be a good Samaritan. You may have heard the expression Good Samaritan. It's the sort of person who helps someone change their tyre on the roadside, or they see some hard luck story in a current affair and they anonymously give a lot of money. It's more than just a do-gooder. You see, Jesus was involved one day in a discussion with a Jewish religious teacher, and that Jewish religious teacher said, "Jesus, what's the best rule in the Old Testament, in what we call the Old Testament?" Now, of course, people argue about rules in religion all the time, and we think that rules are made to be broken, don't we? We have a fairly lax approach to rules and so on. Except when, of course, it's you shouldn't steal when it's my stuff, or you shouldn't run a red light when it's my car going the other way. And Jesus says to this teacher that there are two best rules, and the second one is you shall love your neighbour as yourself. Now, you've got to understand in the first century world that the Jews were put upon by the Romans, and so the Romans weren't their neighbours, you couldn't love them. And tax collectors collected money for the Romans, so you couldn't love them, and prostitutes had sex with Roman soldiers, you couldn't love them. And people didn't keep the rules, and you couldn't love them. So Jesus responds to the man with a story about the parable of the Good Samaritan. And you need to understand this carefully. This is a Jewish religious leader who had his Bible under his belt, kept all the rules, and Jesus said a man was attacked and left half dead by the roadside, and two religious leaders of the Jews walked past him because they didn't want to get involved. And the only person who came to his aid was a Good Samaritan. Just like the Palestinian woman helping the Israeli soldier. That's the kind of divide that was being crossed there. You see, the Samaritans firstly were distantly ethnically related to the Jews, but they had interbred with other nations, so they weren't racially pure. And there's an expression that's come down through the ages, hasn't it? So they weren't racially pure, but worse than that, they only read the first 5 books of the Old Testament. And this Jewish religious leader who knew his Bible back to front read all 39 books. So Jesus is coming to him and giving us the equivalent of a small parish priest making his way to Rome and telling the Pope that he was wrong. Or maybe a bit like a peace advocate saying to a member of the Republican Party who's advocating that we bomb Syria, we bomb this country, we bomb that country. You say you're an evangelical Christian, but I tell you that Gandhi understood Jesus better than you did on non-violence. That's the impact of what Jesus is saying to this religious ruler. And so he's calling for a radical love, a love that crosses boundaries. He didn't get crucified for being nice to people. He got crucified for saying, you are wrong, let me show you a better way. It'd be like me saying to a member of One Nation, you need to love Muslims. You need to go and have a meal with them. To Christians, you need to love your lesbian, gay, bisexual, transsexual, intersexual neighbour and accept them for who they are. Politicians, you need to love refugees and bring them into the country. It's that kind of radical love that got him crucified. because he was telling people, you don't know how to love, let me show you the way. And they didn't take to it very well. So the second best rule is to love your neighbour as yourself. But it got worse for this religious ruler. A few years ago, there was a book called The End of Faith by a guy called Sam Harris, another aggressive atheist. And he said that unless you're a religious fundamentalist, you're not a real religious believer. Moderates, what do they know about faith? And by that he meant that you're violent, that you're intolerant, that you're an ignoramus, basically. He's wrong, of course, but he's right at the same time, because the first rule that Jesus stressed was you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength. You must be obsessed with God. And how do you know who's obsessed with God? Those who really do love their neighbours. There's an expression that my mum often uses. She says, you find better Christians outside than inside of the church. And sometimes that can appear to be true. That there are genuine, honest people outside who love better than the Christian church. We've often stuffed it right up in the way that we live. And so Jesus is saying to this man, not only do you not love your neighbour properly, you don't know the rules, you don't love God either. You wonder why he got killed. But here's the kicker in the tale. It also says that how do you know how to love other people if you don't love God? There's a word for those outside the church. I love my children, but am I really loving them for who they are? Am I living my life through them? I love my partner, but I only love them for what I can get from them? Anyway, another story. So much after Jesus were they and his radical love, they tried to trip him up. So one day they bring to him a woman who's caught in the act of adultery. And that begs a whole lot of questions, doesn't it? How did they catch her? Where was the man? But we're meant to picture a woman who's probably half naked, in tears, ashamed and afraid of her for her life. This bunch of men who don't love her and certainly don't love Jesus, and they bring this woman before him and say, the rules say this woman must be stoned to death for this. What do you say? If the law wins over love, they will embarrass him in front of all the people who follow him, all the outsiders that he loves that they don't. And if love wins over law, well then, they'll show him up to be a false teacher. So he's stuffed either way, is he not? Jesus says, let him who is without sin cast the first stone. In other words, the person here who perfectly loves God and perfectly loves his neighbour, including this woman you've brought here to trip me up, including me, then you can be judge of this woman. If you've got no sin in your life, if you perfectly love God and your neighbour, you chuck the stone. The old wise heads leave first. Most of them, I think, to go and plan Jesus' death, but some of them maybe, just maybe, got it finally. And then the young blokes went. And we're left just with Jesus and the woman. And you're meant to see something in this. All those who sin leave, and it's just Jesus left with the woman. There was a guy called Alexander Solzhenitsyn. Try say that 3 times fast. And he lived in the Soviet Union, and he wrote about the gulags, the concentration camps in the Soviet Union, and for his troubles he got exiled from the USSR and lived in the United States for a time. When he came back to the USSR, he started trying to make friendships with the Soviet leadership. And his mates said, are you crazy? What are you hanging out with these guys for? These are the sorts of people who had you tossed out of the country and imprisoned people. And he said, the line dividing good and evil cuts through the hearts of every human being. And who is willing to destroy a piece of his own heart? He recognised that it wasn't just us versus them. All those who knew that they weren't without sin left, leaving Jesus with a woman. Doesn't that tell you that the only person without sin is Jesus? Not us and them, not the church and those outside the church, but Jesus and every other sucker on the planet. And so what does Jesus say to the woman? Where are those who condemn you? And she says, there's no one here. He says, well, neither do I condemn you. Oh, goody. Love wins, right? But the sting in the tail is, neither do I condemn you. Go and sin no more. So Jesus' love got him crucified because he showed up the religious rulers in their hatred at every step of the way. But it's not an indulgent kind of love. It demands that we change. Now, if I left it there, it would be a lot like Jesus Christ Superstar, would it not? He goes about preaching love, he gets into trouble, thinks, oh, I might as well go along for the ride, and that's the end of the story. but what's the most famous verse in the Bible? I'm sure even if you don't go to church at all, you would be familiar with, "For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believes in him should not perish but have eternal life." Jesus himself said, "Greater love has no one than this, that one lays down his life for his friends." So how does that work? Well, there's many ideas on this, and I'm only giving one, and it's fairly idiosyncratic. But I think there are three opposites to love, rather. The first is hatred, the second is indifference, and the third one is fear. Let's take hatred. The Jewish authorities were so obsessed with loving God and keeping the rules that they hated a whole bunch of other people. And Jesus comes along and exposes that hatred, and they respond in, surprise, surprise, hatred for him. So they hand him over to the Romans to be crucified to get him out of the way. And he responds to their hatred in love. Their hatred doesn't win. It doesn't dominate what he does. It doesn't dominate how he speaks. It doesn't dominate how he carries out what he planned to do. He died, yes, but their hatred was ineffective against him showing the way of love to everybody else. Pontius Pilate, one of the more famous figures in history for the act of washing his hands, washes himself of all responsibility. He knows Jesus isn't guilty of being a revolutionary. He knows Jesus hasn't done anything that warrants him being crucified on a cross, but he does it anyway because it kind of suits his purposes. Big empires, big businesses, big countries, big politics, big whatever you like, is totally indifferent to people's needs and suffering, and they often use violence as a weapon. Jesus responds non-violently and unmasks their violence. And finally, of course, fear. What his disciples do, his best mates who've been with him for 3 years, they nick off and leave him to his fate, shaking in their boots, wondering if the Romans or the Jewish authorities are coming after them. And he gives them hope. But how? Because the cross on itself, Good Friday, is not enough. I'm a big Live fan, and on their first album, the song Operation Spirit has the following lyrics. "Heard a lot of talk about this Jesus, a man of love, a man of strength. But what a man was 2,000 years ago means nothing at all to me today. He could have been telling me about my higher self, but he only lives inside my prayer. So what he was may have been beautiful, but the pain is right now, right here. Friday does nothing without Sunday. It's meaningless without the resurrection, the empty tomb. And that's about love too. Jesus said, 'The Father loves me because I lay down my life so that I may take it again.' The Father loves me because I lay down my life to be crucified so that I might take it up again." I once read a book, I've read a lot of books in my life, but a 740-page book on the resurrection. I'll give you a 2-minute or less summary. Firstly, the Jewish nation knew that there was a world of pain and suffering, anxiety and pain, as Ed Case sings elsewhere. And so they hoped that God would put the world right. It primarily meant putting their world right, but they understood that it meant the entire world in the end. A judgment, a setting things to rights, bringing in an age of peace and love. It sounds hippie, but that's what they believed. But it involved people being raised from the dead bodily, because for a Jew, the good life was about eating and drinking and hanging out with your family, absence of war, peace, this world, not heaven when you die, not harps and all this kind of rubbish. The first century Christians believed that it happened ahead of time to Jesus, and that the age of peace and love has already begun. And if you think about this tiny little group of first century Jews, a tiny little Jewish sect, literally took over the Roman Empire, it's a step of faith, I understand. History takes us to this point. Faith says the thing that makes the most sense about the rise of first century Christianity is that it really happened. And it's a message that for 2,000 years has been stuffed up at times by the church, but it has consistently still turned hate into love. Hear the words of Paul, a first century Jewish teacher who hated Jesus, who hated Christians. And then he writes this: "I am convinced that neither death, nor life, nor angels, nor principalities, nor things present, nor things to come, nor powers, nor height, nor depth, nor any other created thing will be able to separate us from the love of God who is in Christ Jesus, our Lord." Jesus was killed because he taught radical love of God and radical love of neighbour. Something that's hard to model, but he modelled it for us. Jesus was killed because he knew that only love could overcome sin and hatred and indifference in the world. And love, conquered death itself. That's what the resurrection means. And it's begun a new age of love. And after all, that's what we're here for, to love, gather, and serve. So let's do it. Thank you.